there's always this discussion about the intersection of science fiction and horror. And often people bring up Lovecraft in the idea of the cosmic horror. But when I think about cosmic horror, I don't need Cthulhu. All I need is cosmic timescale. All I need is unknowable or unknown, maybe not even unknowable, but unknown forces that are at play in interacting with humans in ways that we can't understand. And I think this movie is a great example of what cosmic horror is. This is a horrifying movie in many ways. It's awesome and awe-inspiring, but also pretty horrifying.
Welcome, friends, to episode 228 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And this week we discuss Stanley Kubrick's 1968 film, 2001: A Space Odyssey. So in the pantheon of films that we've covered and projects we've covered for this podcast, this is one of the more intimidating ones to approach here, mostly due to just sheer magnitude and size that this has in the film community and what it means to science fiction and what it just means in general.
Yeah, so I had never seen this movie. So I'm coming in like a babe in a weird bubble to watch this for the first time and get my experience. And full disclosure, I just finished watching the movie about 30 to 45 minutes before recording. So not only have I only seen it once, I have also just barely had time to sit with my thoughts about it.
Yeah, I really wish that you had a little bit more time to process this one.
It's okay, because we're going to describe the way we're going to cover this. It's very unusual for our podcast because we always tackle the book first and then the movie. In this case, this movie was based on a short story by Arthur C. Clarke, written in 1951, called The Sentinel. Now, that is kind of just like a kernel that formed the basis for this whole story. That story we will talk about briefly. And then we are going to cover the novelization, which was written alongside the development of this movie, is my understanding of it. And we're going to do that next week. I assume this is going to be a lot of answers to a lot of the questions that I have. And whether or not those are canonical, I think will be up for debate because it's Arthur C. Clarke versus Kubrick. And
they worked on both things together,
okay.
But I think each person was sort of driving their own medium's ultimate vision of what was going to happen.
Sure. So, I mean, we're going to get into all of that. And so we'll revisit some of this stuff next week. I'll have more time to sit with it and see if any of my feelings about it change over time, reading the novelization, if that changes things for me. And we'll talk about Arthur C. Clarke as an author, which I'm very interested to get into, but we're going to hold off on because, like you said, this movie's just so big, such an important film, that we want to devote as much time as we can to it in this episode.
Right, and to that end, we have to just get your fresh first perspective take on this film. I know that most people see it as a slow burn. I think that it's clearly very influential for sci-fi in general and just genre filmmaking and the ways that Kubrick likes to have his attention to detail at boundary pushing level at all times. So like to bring all those things together, like how did this strike you as a movie first?
It was incredibly good. This movie lived up to all the hype, which is almost impossible. The closest I think we've had to this was when I watched The Godfather for the first time for the podcast. Mm-hmm. But it's very different, right? Because The Godfather's a crime drama. And it's got incredible performances, amazing filmmaking. But like this is mind-bending science fiction written at a time where just the concepts being dealt with were so new, and it's amazing to me. Like I had to look it up. Like we landed on the moon in 1969.
Mm-hmm.
This movie comes out in 68. So the people who are like as America is watching the moon landing, this movie has come out, and people are probably all thinking like, what are we going to find? And it just the way that would play to someone who doesn't have any concept of that, right? Like they know we're in the space race at the time this movie's coming out. And then I know there's all these conspiracy theories about Kubrick faking the moon landing and all this shit. So like it's such an important film in film history. And then you tie that into American history, and it's just, that's unbelievable.
Yeah. You want to hear another crazy, I mean, and you're talking about the audience seeing it. Think about developing it, because this movie took 4 or 5 years to make.
Right.
The famous picture that you've seen of the Earth is called the Blue Marble. That photo was taken in 1970. So, like, literally getting the perspective of the universe.
Yeah.
And all of this, like, future tech from someone who hasn't seen a picture of the entirety of the Earth.
Yeah, he foresaw how profound that picture would be, and I imagine the person who took the picture may have seen this movie,
along with everyone else who lived at the time.
Yeah, that's so wild to think about. Like I didn't know all the details going into this. But like you take away all the history behind it. This movie looks incredible. The cinematography, the color composition, the scene composition, it is so rich and so vibrant and beautiful. There's like a sparsity to it. There's like a really, everything's clean in a way that like the Alien movies, for example, are all dirty and grimy. And I feel like maybe even in response to this movie and how clean everything is, it has such a specific look and texture to it that were fantastic. And the filmmaking tricks that are employed were just amazing, because like I know that they're not using computer graphics, right? This is 68 and these long confident shots of like, I'm just going to show you this scene and not cut, and we're going to watch someone walk around a room and appear to defy gravity. And like I feel like a lot of this stuff we've seen more and more these days, so we're maybe a little bit like desensitized to it, but this had to absolutely blow people's minds when they saw it for the first time.
Yeah. I mean, I want to talk about the look first, because you're touching on that. So,
yeah.
You know, you talked about the color. Of course, there's a lot of good color pop, but there's this white sort of look at the shots of the spaceships, like are meticulously shot to how they would actually look in space with the reflection from a star of the sun in the distance.
I couldn't believe how accurate to like space physics and stuff. I mean, I'm sure there's some inaccuracies, but there was a huge attempt. And again, like we're just starting to learn about this stuff at this point.
I mean, I don't think it will surprise you to hear that there were physicists that came onto work, like people that were leading their fields in terms of understanding space travel and what NASA was developing, and right at the cutting edge. And Kubrick was so meticulous about wanting it to be as realistic as possible, because to gear up to why this film is so monumental is sci-fi wasn't taking this seriously before in film.
Yeah.
And I would argue in other mediums as well. There's a certain seriousness and tone and like respect given to this sort of film that historically sci-fi was a lot about monsters and way over the top campy sort of things. And so you see a film like this, and I've heard Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, like all these filmmakers that Christopher Nolan all talk about.
Oh, I bet Christopher Nolan. I was thinking about Interstellar a lot while watching this.
Because it's basically the same movie. But,
well, no, but you could see the clear influence.
It's the narrative approach, where this might be more sort of surgical. That's than like scientific and specific. It's like the narrative emotional version, I would say, in some sense, especially with the endings sort of feeling similar. But Steven Spielberg said this was his generation's Big Bang. Like this film, Lucas, these people were in film school when this comes out.
Wow.
And Lucas has come out and said that he doesn't make Star Wars without this. He would have never thought to attempt what he was able to attempt with Star Wars, because Kubrick did it first. And like to be able to do that, and you take Kubrick's hyper fixation on detail and you blend it with hyper realistic cutting edge technology and the things that, I mean, they predicted the iPad in this movie. Literally.
I know. I couldn't believe it. I was like, they have tablets in this movie.
It's just it goes on and on with this, but yeah. So the cinematography is unmatched. I mean, like you get this sense that the way that he chose to frame the camera and a lot of times compose scenes, like you said, were upside down. We don't have any orientation because we're in space, and that makes sense to express that through the cinematography. It was so engaging. Like it's in a film that doesn't have a lot of talking, not a ton of dialogue,
a lot of silence,
very much left to your interpretation of what's happening, and also just watching this, like, it's art. It's just especially like you take the operatic music, like classical music, and you blend it with these super long takes. And I know it's not for everyone, but like it's just like unmatched. There's nothing like it. And like people have attempted, but it's like to come to this level it's impossible. It's the only one person could have done it.
It's totally for me. I do think that the way we cover things trains us, and trains me at least, to watch a movie in a certain way. And that the way I watched this movie, taking notes, thinking, what am I going to be able to say about this? That is the perfect way to watch a film like this. It's the perfect way to watch The Green Knight. Like we've had some of these movies where there's so much going on, there's so much sort of interpretive stuff. It's so rich. And when I'm giving myself 100% to a film and almost studying it as I'm watching it, I get so much out of it. This movie was made at a time where you have to consider what it meant for science fiction when it came out. This movie is profound and interesting, I think, even today, even though it doesn't necessarily look as like convincing as maybe some effects we get today. There are times where you can clearly tell it's a model. There are times where you can tell there is a painting backdrop. There are things that you can tell, okay, but like it looks really good regardless. Don't get me wrong. We've just seen some incredible space films these days, right? And we are used to a certain pace and level of action in a lot of movies, and this isn't that kind of movie. There's always this discussion about the intersection of science fiction and horror, and often people bring up Lovecraft and the idea of the cosmic horror. But when I think about cosmic horror, I don't need Cthulhu. All I need is cosmic timescale. All I need is unknowable or unknown, maybe not even unknowable, but unknown forces that are at play in interacting with humans in ways that we can't understand. And I think this movie is a great example of what cosmic horror is. This is a horrifying movie in many ways. It's awesome and awe-inspiring, but also pretty horrifying at different times. So this, I love that. I love sci-fi horror blends, and I love cosmic horror. I think this movie actually is one of the better cosmic horror movies I've ever seen, which is kind of weird to say because I don't think I hear this being called that very often, but I absolutely was getting that.
I can see why it's not labeled as cosmic horror, but I like that your interpretation brings a lot of that to it. So, I don't think you'd be surprised to hear that, like, it was extremely divisive when it came out, critical response and audiences. I think most people were in awe of what they saw, but some people also felt like, the beginning 22 minutes or so have no dialogue. It's very much like you have to buy into this atmosphere that Kubrick is building. And
you talk about like the prehistoric sort of dawn of man scenes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then there's an additional little bit too where it continues to not have any dialogue until he gets to the base, I believe. And I think, especially to today's audience, that's unheard of almost. There's not many films that are going to let you have like 30 minutes of the film basically before you hear someone speak. And then the ending of the film also has, I think I read somewhere there's like 88 minutes of no dialogue in the film where there's like not any dialogue happening.
Yeah, I believe
and to believe in yourself that strongly that you can tell a story with just like a razor's edge of story. I think at least he does that at the beginning so that you can kind of check the box of whether you're in for this experience or not. That's kind of like the barrier to entry is like, did you make it through the first 30 minutes and enjoy yourself? Then you're probably going to like the rest of it.
Man, I was so into it. And again, the way we're watching this movie, I think lends itself. But like, if you can actively watch the movie and like be thinking, why is he doing this? And that's what I'm at, right? I'm like, why are we lingering so long? What is being conveyed to me in these scenes? Why, this sequence? What's being told? And it leaves me to try and interpret. And I think that's where he wants you to be. He wants you as an audience member to be asking those questions and to be interpreting what you're seeing and trying to suss out meaning. And I love that.
And I think the movie all the way through wants you, even near the end. I don't think that there's a actual ending. I think for a long time, people have kind of argued back and forth what this movie is even about.
Oh, I bet. I bet.
And going back to the critical response, like a lot of critics noted that it was an exploration of existentialism, human evolution, technology, AI, and then obviously extraterrestrial life. And the film now is widely regarded as one of the greatest and most influential films ever made. In 1991, it was deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant by the United States Library of Congress and selected for preservation in the National Film Registry.
Well deserved. Like I can tell that that's absolutely true.
And I think in terms of like especially American-made films, it might be the most aesthetically significant and culturally and historically significant. Like I can't think of a film that carries this much weight and baggage.
I'm sure there are some, but it's up there, right?
It's up there, yeah.
And like, so I want to say, even today, regardless of it, again, its historical importance, which is difficult for me to like completely ignore, but I genuinely love this movie. I thought it was great. I don't know if it's my favorite sci-fi movie of all time, but it's up there. It's in the conversation, and watching it in 2022, that says something.
Yeah, and I would also say that whatever your favorite sci-fi movie is, owes a debt of gratitude to this film.
Of course, yeah. I mean, so many movies do. So many sci-fi movies do. Absolutely. I want to ask you what your history is with this movie. Do you remember the first time you saw it, and how many times have you seen it now?
Yeah, I was much too young the first time I saw it. It was one of those times where people told me it was one of the greatest movies of all time, and I was probably 13, 14, something like that.
That's a bad time to watch this movie, probably.
It's not a good time to watch it. It's extremely slow in the beginning. It's like, I didn't, it definitely was not on my list of favorite movies at a time when I was like, Jurassic Park is my favorite movie. It's kind of hard to switch gears to something like this. I then revisited in college for sure. I think I've probably seen the movie 5 times now, and each time it's like, it's meant more to me, and this time maybe the most, because I really understand the cultural significance, and then just like having worked in the film industry and trying to like fathom what it would even be like to not only create something this intense, but under someone like Kubrick, with someone who it just like every movie's a miracle that it gets made, but this is pretty much the only thing like it, Yeah. Like I told you before, it took 4 years to create. 2 years with actors, 2 years with special effects. Like half the budget was spent on special effects. And everything, all the model work and everything that you were noticing, meticulously, painstakingly created. They were shooting in they were creating like mechanical rigs and things to give motion to the ships, and they're taking like longer exposure of these ships and everything, and just the way it took such a long time to make such a small amount. It's almost like a stop motion animation.
Yeah. So many magic tricks being employed. Like I know that there are all these tricks, perspective tricks, slowing things down, all these things that achieve these effects and they're all incredible because you can still use them today. And that's the thing that I hope people don't lose, don't lose sight of what we had to do before we had computer graphics to just do everything for us.
Yeah, I mean, use your resources where you see fit, but because you can save yourself a lot of time nowadays and still achieve something incredible. But yeah, just the main thing is we're talking about you talked about the rotating rigs, basically, where we were able to create the sense of people walking on walls and weightlessness and things like that. So those were actually physically engineered and created for this film, right?
Sure.
So like
Yeah.
there's this giant cylindrical like structure as big as a house that was created for this, that was filmed into, and there's so many of these shots that are like this, where like there's actual physical motorized motion happening with the structure while they're filming into that.
Yeah, had to be. I mean, I'm watching it and I'm like, I can tell what's actually happening here.
So it's like a marvel of like carpentry and engineering and like filmmaking, and
And the only reason I can tell that is I've seen other people do it in other movies.
right, like Christopher Nolan in Inception.
Inception, yeah. I'm thinking of there's a Metallica music video called "The Memory Remains." That's the entire music video is like this. It's like a rotating thing. So like, there's just I've seen it enough, and I've like learned how it's achieved enough times, to where I understand it now. Even like, what was that one? There's like a Sugar Ray song where they did something like this, right?
I believe it.
Yeah, like music video. So I'm like, okay, I know what this is, but at the time, this had to be, like pretty groundbreaking for most people who saw it.
I mean, like watching it as a modern viewer, trying to figure out how they practically had that the red pen floating when he was.
I assume just on a string or something. I don't know.
Kind of. They use a piece of glass with the perspective to where you couldn't see it, and I guess when she pulls it off, you can kind of see that she's like pulling it off of a surface if you look really closely. But she plucked it right out of the air. It looked completely believable. Like I would have thought. I thought for sure. I'm like, they don't have CG to erase the string. Like, what are you gonna do?
It's amazing. Anyway, before we get too far along into the movie, which I know we're both eager to talk about, let's take maybe 5-10 minutes to talk about the short story, and then we can get into that. So this is technically based off of a short story called The Sentinel by Arthur C. Clarke. I will describe Arthur C. Clarke, in detail next week. But one thing that I did see about this that I feel like is notable is that he wrote it in 1948 and attempted to have it published for a BBC competition in which it failed to place. It was first published in a magazine called 10 Story Fantasy in its spring 1951 issue under the title Sentinel of Eternity. It was subsequently published as part of a short story collection in 1953, 1967, and 1972. And I think that's when he changed the name. Despite this story's initial failure, it would go on to change the course of Clarke's career, which I could totally see, right? Especially with the adaptation that ends up getting made. So just briefly, the story is pretty different than the movie, other than this sort of kernel that a lot of the movie builds off of. And basically, the story starts out with this moon geologist who, or I forget what he says. If you want to be pedantic, it's this other thing, which means like study of the moon's geography. Anyway, he is on the moon. He's with someone else. He spots something in the distance, and he's like, I'm going to go check that out. And then he takes him and this other guy, go to look into it, to investigate it. And when they get there, they find this weird pyramid that has been thus far undiscovered. Now, it's notable that there's a base on the moon. They talk about driving in these, like, crawlers. So there's this sort of moon travel has been established. And again, 1948. He talks about how there's this force field. He doesn't call it a force field, but there's like some sort of energy surrounding the thing. It takes them 20 years, we find out later, because this is like the narrator talking about something that happened in the past. It takes them 20 years to penetrate it. And then once they do, and they determine that this Sentinel, this object, has been on the moon for millions of years. And because of something about the way they can like test the dust or something. And so he's like, this was here before life on Earth, or while life on Earth was even developing. And so you get that sense of cosmic awe, I think, and cosmic horror, a little bit, touch of it, is in the story itself. I that was one thing I was struck with, how there was an awe-inspiring moment as they stand together looking at this thing, and they're realizing what it means. And then they have sort of a hypothesis about what it means, but since we're presented with nothing else, I think we're safe to assume that they're right. And he says that they destroy it. That humans decide to destroy this thing with the theory that it was left as a device that would tell whoever left it that humanity has advanced to a stage where they could come to their own moon, find this thing, and destroy it. And that would somehow send a signal. and we're left with the ominous sense that a signal has been sent and somebody else is coming to Earth. And there's like a touch of trepidation I detected in one of the lines where he says, "The old are often insanely jealous of the young." So there's like a little bit of like we don't really know how they're going to be when they get here, but they're coming. And that's where the story ends. And we can see how this idea of this pyramid being left on the moon is millions of years old. You can see how that affects the movie, and we get the obelisk. But just as a story, let's talk about it first. Short thing, only 6 pages long. You can find it online for free. I do recommend checking it out if you're a fan of this movie. You might as well see where it all came from.
Yeah, I mean, like, I was skeptical. I was like, I don't know. Kubrick he always does. I'm pretty sure most of his movies are based on books. Which,
yeah,
I
think that's true.
I think I literally mentioned this in our last episode, where I was talking about, like, using existing material can be a strong choice. It's like, someone like Kubrick clearly can impose his will on a story, and like, you can tell it's his, even though he's using other people's source material. He changes things, does things, because it's a short story on such a big sort of concept. I was skeptical a little bit, and I went in open-minded and really enjoyed it myself, especially for like short. Is this almost Flash?
Yeah, I don't know what the word count is. I didn't look that up, but it is yeah, it's borderline Flash, if not actually Flash.
This story made me think, like, man, I really should check out some more like Flash science fiction, because it so fits. Like, you just give me a concept and then explore it for a little while, and it's satisfying. And this one in particular, I was like, wow, there's a lot of seeds that could grow, to further the metaphor there, that you could, foster and grow into something that Kubrick made. There was also like the sort of haunting thing of, at what point does society and humanity get to a dangerous level, I guess, in the cosmos, maybe? Right. Is what could be seen, or at least a level at which you can comprehend and engage with some sort of higher intelligence. And
right.
It's just a fun concept to explore. And then this idea of like activating this, what was it, like a tetrahedron or some sort of like unknowable shape or something that like started reacting when they got close to it. And it was like a beacon kind of thing where you're like, here they come.
Yeah.
I found that to be like a fun story.
Yeah, it's it's dealing with a lot of big sci-fi topics, right, that scientists have been discussing. You'll hear people like Carl Sagan has weighed in on this. Neil deGrasse Tyson will have opinions about, like, is there a point where we have become noisy enough and loud enough in a cosmic sense to actually draw the attention of other civilizations who have somehow remained hidden from us, maybe by choice, maybe not. And at a certain point, do you then welcome their attention, and do we want that? What does that look like? This is, kind of the fertile soil in which a lot of science fiction has been grown. And yeah, I mean, I was amazed at how there was a lot of actually fairly crunchy, sort of hard science in this. There was these discussions of what the weight is like. It's like he's like, I weigh about 40 pounds on the moon, even with my spacesuit. And if I fell 600 feet, it would be equivalent to falling 100 feet, so it would be deadly. And you don't want to get overconfident. And there's like all these things that, like, I couldn't check the math or whatever, but like I assume are at least fairly accurate. And this is, again, 1948, so this is a lot of like theoretical, what's it going to be like on the moon? We don't know. We've never been there.
I also liked the sort of the interaction in the base, where it's like he wants to go explore this weird reflection that he sees, and they're telling him not to, and that he could get killed out there. And he's like this gung-ho astronaut kind of guy. He's like, I could get something named after myself or whatever, right?
Yeah. Well, they're gonna make fun of you and call it like the Fool's Ridge or something.
Yeah.
I also liked when they first arrived. He's like, what sort of radiations? And this is very, I think, applicable to the time, right? This is the dawn of the nuclear bomb. He's saying, what sort of radiation have we stumbled on as humanity, and what could I be subjecting myself to just standing here? And that had to be a pretty new thought at the time. So really cool, sort of cutting edge stuff at the time. There is a lot about like this idea that Mars once had abundant plant life and like maybe even some other sorts of life on it, that when underneath the surface that, had a bunch of this liquid water that then got absorbed. Like, I don't know. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. I think a lot of that has been disproven. But again, we hadn't been to the moon yet. So like anything was like kind of still possible and on the table. So it was up to these, writers to just imagine. Much like, talk about, Princess of Mars. Like, we had no idea what was on Mars. It could be whole civilizations out there. So, people's imaginations ran wild. We see a little bit of that here, but still, I think an interesting story worth reading, and especially with what it would go on to affect almost 20 years later, right? Like 17 years later, when the movie would get made.
Again, I enjoyed it. I recommend checking it out.
I'll link it in the show notes. I'll put it down there if you want to click it and read it. It's a quick read.
So getting into the film here, I want to talk about like how it came about, right? Like what got Kubrick excited about this. And I was reading that he, this is after Dr. Strangelove. So he's already done like this military comedic satire where he, skewers.
Did you say Strangelove was the last black and white film he made?
I think it is. Yeah,
okay.
Pretty sure it is.
Interesting. Because this is color and it's got a lot of color. So it's amazing to make that transition from black and white to color and have it already be this visually astounding.
Well, I mean, like, obviously there had been color back with, like, Wizard of Oz and things like that, but, like, it was starting to become the norm at this point.
But for a filmmaker, right?
Right.
Like, to show that he's like, oh, yeah, I can fucking nail a color movie, too. Don't you have any doubt about it?
Well, and honestly, you're leading me perfectly into one of the major things here, and that's just that TV was taking over all of people's entertainment time, right? And so the films had to figure out a way to be different and lure people back to the theaters. And if this sounds familiar to you, stop me.
Yeah.
But it's people want to stay home. They want to watch in their house. It's more convenient. It's easier. But then you get the way that you get people back in the seats is you give them these amazing adventures that they cannot experience in the same way in the home. And so Kubrick sought out a studio to make a sci-fi film. He obtained financing and distribution from MGM with the selling point that it would be marketed with their ultra widescreen Cinerama format. So again, 4:3, more squared off look of a TV at the time, or you can go sit in a theater with a bunch of people and see the Cinerama, large format 70 millimeter projection of a Stanley Kubrick film that you wouldn't see, you can't get the same experience in the home. So that was the idea behind it. After they started pre-production, Kubrick and science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke went to see a 70 millimeter film in a domed theater at New York World's Fair in 1965 called To the Moon and Beyond, which was created by Hollywood-based graphic film, where a 23-year-old graphic artist Douglas Trumbull was working. Quote, they made a wide range of space movies, mostly for NASA and the Air Force, Trumbull recalls. Kubrick hired Graphic to do preliminary design studies for his and Clarke's film, then titled Journey Beyond the Stars. So he was blown away clearly by this like domed projection that he saw of this like, again, they're making things for NASA and the Air Force and proving that these things can be filmed realistically. So he's recruiting people. They brought in consultants from space agencies and industry to advise on things like spacecraft design, computer display, and control design. Kubrick hired Harry Lang, a spacecraft designer for rocket builder Wernher von Braun, and spacecraft designer Frederick Ordway. Trumbull goes on to say that Harry Lang was a true spacecraft designer. He knew all about ballistics, orbital mechanics, rocket fuel, and rocket nozzles. So he brought to the movie a tremendous accuracy and verisimilitude to real spacecraft possibilities. So again, bringing all of these experts in to create the most realistic possible movie is like the Kubrickian detail, right? Like he's making they very well could have launched some of these things into space and like had it work based on the fact that they had these like people who knew what the fuck they were doing creating these.
I was amazed. You get these wheel designs for rotating stations that would simulate some manner of gravity, which is something we see time and again in science fiction. You see a docking sequence where the ship coming to dock has to match its rotation with the opening in which it's going to be flying into. And I'm like, that's just like what we see later in Interstellar. And it's such a cool sequence too, and it's not explained. You have to interpret that that's what's going on. It's so cool. And again, the stuff with the gravity is like, if you don't like, there's a shorthand for understanding space and like space physics that we all have now because we've grown up on this stuff that I just think was not super prevalent. Like a lot of what you'd seen was like Star Trek You know, like it's not super accurate when it comes to that kind of stuff, at least, or it's not.
They're not having to deal with the gravity in the same way. And in Star Trek, you know, they're walking around normally because they have some sort of artificial,
just hand waved away, artificial gravity, whatever.
Gravity,
yeah, exactly.
So I want to move into sort of some of the performances and the look at the film, because I talked about before, if Interstellar is the more emotional, this is the more surgical. And to talk about, like, again, going for realism, I guarantee that they analyzed the way that astronauts were actually interacting with ground control and all these other, in the way that they're not showing a ton of emotion because they're supposed to be calm in all of these situations.
I was just thinking about that. Yeah, like astronauts are said to be this like cut above, this like they're another breed entirely. It seems like they're so calm.
They're built different.
They have they're like. They're also like doctors, like they like a doctorate level knowledge,
right?
And they're also elite athletes, and they're this peak performance, and they are incredibly calm under pressure. Like they don't panic. Like there's all these things that go into that, and I was seeing all of that into the character of Dave, especially. Like I thought he was trying to embody that.
Well, and to get into like the overall tone of the film too is like I feel like there's audiences who see this as very dull. There's not a lot of emotion. There's not a lot of like anxiety that people were expecting from a film, a sci-fi film especially. Yeah. And just like the way that he's like so confidently saying like this, he's literally giving people the template of like what they would be viewing when they would see like the moon landing and any other, the missions that they would hear. It's very like clipped. Their speech is very short and they're very like to the point. And the way that they analyze situations, like all of this is in this film.
Yeah.
And I just think that's incredible that like that they're going for that sort of realism to the point that the performance, like there's so much of this movie that's so painstakingly like meticulous. It's so slow and deliberate. And, you know, that goes all the way through to his performances that he was able to get out of his actors and the pacing of the film. So a couple fun things that I found behind the scenes that I definitely wanted to mention. Arthur C. Clarke first became aware of the project when the following cable from Roger Karras at MGM landed on his desk in 1963. Now, I don't know how to read sort of Morse code or whatever they were sending back and forth, but I'm going to attempt to do it, and I'll try to do my best for the voice of the time. Stanley Kubrick, Dr. Strangelove, Paths of Glory, etc. Interested in doing film on ETS? Stop. Are you interested? Query. Thought you were a recluse. Stop. Clarke replied with the following cable. Frightfully interested in working with infant? Terrible. Stop. Contact my agent? Stop. What makes Kubrick think I'm a recluse? Query.
Wait, what's the infant thing? I don't understand.
So, yeah, I had to look it up too. So basically it was, you know, Stanley Kubrick reaching out, interested in doing a film. Clarke's reply was frightfully interested in working with infant terrible, which I looked up is like, I think it's like a French phrase, and it means a person whose unconventional or controversial behavior or ideas shock, embarrass, or annoy others.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so they started off immediately just like with the banter. They were right back and forth. He's calling him a recluse. He's calling him a child that he's like shocking and embarrassing or annoying to others. So interesting setup to them beginning to work together. I feel like we had two very strong sort of used to getting their way sort of people in the room together.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a few sections to get through here. I'm going to start with the first one. A tribe of hominins is driven away from its watering hole by a rival tribe. The next day, they find an alien monolith has appeared in their midst. After their next hunt, they return to drive their rivals away with the newly discovered tool. Millions of years later, Dr. Hayward Floyd, chairman of the United States National Council of Aeronautics, travels to Clavius Base, a U.S. lunar outpost. During a stopover at Station 5, he meets Russian scientists who are concerned that Clavius seems to be unresponsive. He refuses to discuss rumors of an epidemic at the base. At Clavius, Hayward addresses a meeting of personnel to whom he stresses the need for secrecy with respect to their newest discovery. His mission is to investigate a recently found artifact, an identical monolith buried 4 million years earlier near the lunar crater Tycho. He and others ride in a moon bus to the monolith. As they examine the object, it emits a high-powered radio signal.
Start of this movie, I immediately was like, oh, this is like one of the most famous movie openings of all time.
One of the most iconic matching transitions ever. Yeah.
I recorded it. I put it on our Instagram story, by the way, which will be probably gone by the time you hear this. But if you were following us already, then you would have seen it. Very cool. And I was like, okay, I can tell that this is greatness, right? You get this really big opening classical number, which hopefully we had as the intro to this episode if it worked out.
And so a question for you: the what we see, I've since learned that this is a weapon that Moon Watcher, I think his name is using, and then throws it into the air, and then I assumed satellite ship of some kind, but people say that it's actually like some sort of nuclear weapon or something, and it's like sort of showing a transition from the early days of weapons to the modern idea of weapons, where we are now potentially advancing into another echelon of cosmic sort of.
Well, let me tell you what I saw. So I saw these, early man, right? Like when we're still mostly ape, but not completely. We saw a battle over resources. We saw sort of human nature in its most primal form play out. And then the monolith arrives and is discovered. And there's fear, there's awe, there's confusion, and then they touch the monolith. And then the next sequence we see is the one, I guess I'd call it a hominin, that's what you said, realizing it can use the bone to hit. And I think this is implying that perhaps that spark of understanding could have been imparted by the monolith itself.
I definitely think that's a good read. Yeah, I think that's probably part of it. Yeah,
which is a theory that people to this day have. Some people hold. Some people at least have seriously considered the idea of ancient aliens. Right? If you ever watched that, like
the meme, dude, I got the meme in my head.
Yeah, the meme, dude. Right? Ancient aliens, long ago, somehow came down and imparted some sort of knowledge. This goes all the way back to when there's just hominins, right? And like maybe even the spark of understanding of how to use tools. So that creates an interesting egg and chicken scenario, right? Like, are they orchestrating? Are they creating humanity through this action? Are they sort of Prometheus, right? Like is that Prometheus who steals the fire? Mm-hmm. Right? Are they giving us the fire? And they're saying, here, go make a fire.
No, and I think that lines up with what I was saying. Like, human nature is to fight, right? There's always going to be a certain amount of violence or like fighting over something. There's always going to be the weapon. So
and I think it is a weapon, but it's also a tool. And I think it's sure. Notable that the first use of a tool is as a weapon, I think is what's said here, and I think that is probably plausible, right? As a way to hunt. But when he throws it in the air, it transitions into a ship, and my thought immediately was, or a ship or a satellite or something, who knows what. My thought was, it's a tool into a tool. That's what I saw it as. Whether or not it's a weapon, I don't know. It's definitely one tool transitioning into another more sort of elaborate and advanced tool, but yet still a tool made by humanity and flung into the sky.
Yeah. So the idea of it being a weapon I read in my research, but every time I've seen this film, I've felt the same way as you.
Yeah.
It's a tool, right? And the advancement of tools eventually become little inventions together to create space travel and things like that. Which is
drawing a clear line between, if the monolith gave that spark of knowledge, that bone leads to this spaceship.
But I would say that the tool weapon thing is two sides of the same coin, right? Like either way, it's like it can be interpreted either way. It means the same thing.
And whether or not it's given deliberately, like a like some sort of informational download, or is some sort of knowledge imparted, or is it just the sort of reality bending nature of this monolith? Does it awaken something in the mind of these creatures as they try and grasp what's happening? Is that so? It's like, where is it coming from? Is it coming from within in response to external stimulus, or is it literally knowledge being sent? And I don't think we know, and it's open to interpretation. But I think it's really cool.
To make a fun connection here, in the way that Kubrick created this sci-fi film that would pave the way for all these other sci-fi films, maybe the monolith is like showing what can be, so that it can be done. You know that there's some other technology that you don't understand out there that's so advanced that you can strive for, something to strive for. Almost.
I think there is some theories about like the Neanderthals versus like early humans, and like early humans developed the use of tools, at least, I don't think exclusively, but more quickly. And because of that advancement, we're able to wipe out the Neanderthals, or mostly. Although I've also heard that maybe they weren't completely wiped out. I don't know.
Well, then the aliens also like helped us build the pyramids and stuff too, right? Like it's like. So yeah, moving into this next part of the description there, we get this person who's like sort of commuting to the moon.
Such a cool sequence, right? And that set that you were talking about is so silent, and we're just watching. And I think this is just like him flexing, like, I'm going to make an accurate space film, and I'm going to show you what that would look like. And it's going to be a future that is plausible and within reach. And not so grandiose as to be beyond belief, but actually recognizably human and recognizably our society, right? Like, I didn't know if, like, because I think it's Pan American is the company, and I was like, was there like actual product placement in this movie? I don't know.
Oh yeah, for sure. There was a Hilton sign, there was a Pan Am, there's tons of IBM.
So that's where you're getting the funding from, I guess.
maybe. I mean,
some of it probably. I mean, it's probably expensive ass movie, so you probably needed it.
Extremely expensive, yeah. I mean, it went 4 years, and I think it cost something between like 10 and 16 million at the time.
But the funny thing is, as someone who is so like skeptical of capitalism and often antagonistic towards it, and to put it mildly, to see capitalism so on display here, it actually imparts a sense of dystopia to me.
I didn't like it, yeah.
Yeah, it's like the idea that they're, that you're traveling on a Pan American to the space station, and we're going to, a Hilton on the moon. Like, that's kind of gross. And I wonder if it probably still was at the time, but maybe, I don't know if that attitude has changed so much over time. I don't know.
Yeah, why is my Kubrickian crazy film also at the same time weirdly corporate at the beginning, and like very businessmen in a suit on I can't be home for my kid's birthday, and like that, I was like, weird, but I think for the time it was what was the normal, and he was trying to make the future seem like it's more in the now, like I can't take credit for this. I heard somebody in a video talk about this, but this idea of he's not even looking out the window, right? He's asleep and he's on his way to the moon. Like that's how normal all of this is, right? It doesn't matter. He's like, oh, I've done this a million times.
Yeah.
Although he does linger at the toilet a lot to like look at the sign to learn how to go to the bathroom in space.
Well, it had like 10 paragraphs of description of what you had to do. So yeah, I mean, just so cool. And then the little shoes that say like grip sleeves or something that the stewardess is wearing, and I assume it's kind of like Velcro, is my guess.
I think so. Yeah, I think you're right.
Just so many cool little details, and these curved sets and these padded walls. So much detail went into the thought of how these scenes would look, right? It's just really cool. And like when you appreciate the filmmaking that's going on, to me, that's enough. Like in the world building, we're learning so much about what this version of the future looks like. And there's also this interesting thing. So I meant to say this at the start of the episode. Sorry. Okay. I was on a panel at the Nebula convention this last weekend, where I talked about the challenges of writing when you have ADHD, because I have that. And I thought the panel went really great, got a lot of good responses. One of the things about ADHD is your brain goes in all these weird places, right? So I'm realizing that's happening as I'm bringing this up, which made me laugh. But where my brain just went is that there's another convention coming up later this year called WorldCon, which we've talked about. That's where they award the Hugo Awards. And at that convention, I was reading through the panels, there's a panel about science fiction, these certain science fiction films that have been made where we are now, in our present, past the point of the quote-unquote future of those movies. And the panel is discussing what the perception of the future that is now our past, what we can learn about how we view ourselves, and how we viewed ourselves in the past versus even how we view ourselves now. What were people saying and what were people predicting into our future? And so I was also kind of looking at this movie that way, like it was interesting to see what Kubrick and Clarke thought about the future of humanity and where we would be in, the year 2001, which I guess this movie is. It doesn't say that, but it's in the title, so I assume it is. We do get one reference to something being made in like 1996 or something, so we know we're in that kind of time frame.
HAL, I think, was 97, yeah.
I just think it's cool. I don't know. That's a huge topic. It's a topic for a panel to discuss. But it's
you also just reminded me of the fact that like, I guess I've never thought about this, but maybe sort of the reason why this podcast can be scattered at times is because we're both neurodivergent ADHD people.
Yeah, I think that is probably accurate. And one of the things I talked about on my panel was the nature of flow states and how that is like the way I combat ADHD is by trying to achieve flow state. And I've realized that whenever I'm recording this podcast, I'm in one. So
Yeah.
I'm in one now. So anyway, let's continue.
Yeah, so we get this discussion of an epidemic, which I thought was wild, because it's like, just to be like, this is our cover story, there's an epidemic, is pretty fucking terrifying when you think about enclosed bases.
And it's a cover story. Which like that, an epidemic in space on a lunar base is already an interesting sci-fi premise.
Right. And that's what he teases out. Like, when you first see this movie, you don't know what it's about. You're like, holy shit, is there an epidemic in this movie?
Well, since it's horror, man, I'm telling you. And then you get, there's a mysterious, they weren't able to land. No one's responding. So the mystery of space is scary, right? And then we arrive there, we learn that there's something's been discovered. That's scary. What is it? We don't know. The way that they're all sort of ho-hum about it is notable. And then when they're all walking down into that dig site, the music is so good. It's so powerful at evoking just like dread. Like I felt like my heart was in my throat, and I didn't know why. But partly it's just the music, but also this circumstance where, can you imagine? Like, it's hard. I mean, this movie asks you to, I guess, but like, imagine walking up to something. It's a monolith, something that is millions of years old, left by an alien civilization for unknown reasons, emitting unknown forces. Like, it's got some sort of crazy magnetic field that they've detected, but who knows what else is going on with this thing. And now you're walking up to it. Like, that would be one of the scariest moments, and thrilling, and just like awe-inspiring, and that's all going on. But at the same time, they're being kind of ho-hum about it. Especially is evidence when they turn around and go, let's get a picture with the monolith, and they all start gathering in front of it.
They're very much like military. Like,
yeah,
that's their procedure, and so they're all like very brave about everything.
Yeah.
They're doing it for mankind, and they're so all of it is approached in that sort of perspective. But
it's not quite like, hey, let's get a selfie with this thing, but it felt a little bit like that.
It's basically like that. Notably, there's no score in this film. It's just classic pieces that Kubrick hand selected.
Well, I wasn't sure, because like, so you're saying this is an existing piece, all these like voices like rising, like, ooh, that was very dramatic and like pulse pounding.
From what I understand, there was a score that was being developed because the studio wanted it, and Kubrick was against it from the start. And then once they got about halfway, Kubrick was like, look, I'm not using the score. I'm going to use these classical pieces that I've selected because they fit.
Wow.
And I mean, it's incredible to listen to. And like I said before, it's like an opera. This movie's so connected to music as well. And in the pacing, and then the plotting nature of it, and the way that it like interacts with the music and everything. And sound in general. Like one of the major things was, up to this point, I don't think that, like, from what I could understand, everyone was in awe of it because it realistically depicted the sounds that in space. Like, you're not hearing ships traveling.
Really quiet. Space would be incredibly
hearing
quiet.
Anything, as an astronaut, if you're hearing anything, you're hearing yourself breathing, and you're hearing your equipment.
Yep.
Like in your suit. That's what we heard, and that's extremely realistic. And also it makes me feel claustrophobic.
Yeah,
it builds
I
up
can
the
see
tension. It builds up, it's just a great devices that he's using here to represent realistic space exploration.
Well, and there's like there's an unsettling nature to a lot of the sounds too, where it's like my wife mentioned, because she's in the other room and she could hear it.
Right.
Like, this movie sounds weird from the other room. It's like, what? Like, there's like weird sounds. There's beeping. There's like, and it's really loud, and the music is so out of nowhere, and then it rises and falls. Really cool. But one thing I wanted to say about the classical music, the choice to use it, is it also references the history of music for humanity, right? And the emotion that classical music can evoke in people is often highly abstract and maybe interpretive, right? And so by using that kind of music on these scenes, he is evoking that sense of like ineffable majesty to what you're seeing, like a quality that you can't put into words. And I think it is smart to do that.
It feels ageless, right? Yeah, it feels ageless.
Yeah, but very human.
We always talk about how life imitates art, and in this way, I think Kubrick, for a lot of the ways that, Star Trek informed cell phones and all these other things that people want to create once they see, a lot of things pop up in this film that continue to be like referenced and used and things like that. But one of the major things that I was reading was like this connection to music, and the way that like astronauts after this film, I guess, have been made to listen to classical music. Like it's some sort of connection has been made there. So like they wake up to classical music, and I know like Montessori schools and things like that will have classic music playing in the hallways, just being like that far ahead of the curve, and maybe even setting some of the trends in that way of like this sort of music being important, something more primal than just you like the music or it's something for a film. It's like there's something that it speaks to that we can't describe.
There was this one shot where the ship is coming down from the station to land on the moon, and it comes in, and we see the doors open, and it's lowering down, and I can tell it's a model, but then there's all these little people moving on the sides, and like you can tell they're real people. And on the left side, they're watching 3 screens, and one of the screens is showing what we're seeing happen in the center, which is this spaceship coming down through the. And I was blown away, because I know, again, this is not CGI. Like, how are they doing this? And I can't even imagine. But like I've seen enough Corridor Crew where they break down these shots that I know there's trickery afoot. So I'd love to hear them break down like this scene, because I'm like, how did they even do this? I don't know.
I guarantee there's so much out there, and this is another thing I wanted to ask people to do. Like, if you're interested in what we're talking about, we're scratching the surface, people. I promise you. Look up. There's video after video after video, article after article, people analyzing it to almost no end. It's one of the most analyzed films out there.
I bet.
There's a couple that I wanted to shout out. There was a filmmaker IQ video called The History and Science of the Slit Scan Effect, which like gave me a really good, it's like 15 minutes. So when we get to the slit scan technology, which is how they did this sort of going through the, whatever you want to call that, space-time kind of thing, the way that they achieved that was very practically done. And like, I'm not going to be able to do it tons of justice. So check that out. It's called The History and Science of the Slit Scan Effect, used in Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey.
Okay, I'll make sure to put that in the show notes.
And then another one that I think, just in terms of putting this film into context for people, there's one, Warner Brothers Entertainment. It's sort of a retrospective kind of thing, looking back at the film, and it's a bunch of filmmakers. I'm sure it's included with Blu-rays and things like that. It's called 2001: A Space Odyssey, on the Shoulders of Kubrick, The Legend of 2001.
Wow.
And it really does a great job of like describing what this film needs, and the painstaking efforts that were taken and things like that.
Yeah. Well, one last note I had is that I definitely noticed that this guy touches the monolith in the same way that the apes did, the hominins did in the early sequence of the film. Same thing, put his hand on it. And I think it could just be a mirroring. It could, maybe that's what activates it. It seems like they're taking pictures of it, but they'd already been taking so many pictures of it. Unclear to me what causes it. I know you said that you read somewhere that someone interpreted it to be the sun touching the monolith is what causes this to go off. But that doesn't really hold water to me, because like that could, like the sun's hit it a bunch of times, right? Like something set it off. I think it might be the touch, but like, is he the first person to touch it? Someone else probably has. So I don't know, but something sets it off, and it sets off the signal. Unclear.
Well, I think it's this the person, it was more in the description of this, and it was taking some liberties, I felt, so I cut it out. But I think it's the combination of something touching it, and then the alignment of like the planets or stars and the sun hitting it in a certain angle.
We do see a lot of alignment shots with like planets and stuff, where it's implying that is somehow important.
There's the important shot when they're touching it, where it like looks up at the sky and the sun is just cresting over the monolith.
That monolith view is really cool.
That's why I think somebody drew importance from the sun specifically activating it, but I don't think that that's necessarily true. Good interpretation, but not mine.
It almost seemed to me like they were disrespecting it in taking the picture, and it was like, all right, if you're not going to take me serious, I'm about to blast your brains with a crazy radio signal.
I'm sure that within the metaverse of this story, that is part of it. Okay, so 18 months later, the American spacecraft Discovery 1 is bound for Jupiter, with mission pilots and scientists Dr. Dave Bowman and Dr. Frank Poole on board, along with 3 other scientists in suspended animation. Most of Discovery's operations are controlled by HAL, a HAL 9000 computer with a human personality. When HAL reports the imminent failure of an antenna control device, Dave retrieves it in an in an extravehicular activity, EVA pod, but finds nothing wrong. HAL suggests reinstalling the device and letting it fail so the problem can be verified. Mission Control advises the astronauts that the results from their Twin 9000 computer indicate that HAL is in error about the reporting, but HAL blames it on human error. Concerned about HAL's behavior, Dave and Frank enter an EVA pod so they can talk without HAL overhearing, and agree to disconnect HAL if he is proven wrong. HAL follows their conversation by lip reading.
Yeah. Okay, so the 18-month jump I thought was super unexpected. I didn't know that was going to happen. I thought this guy was like going to go to the ship because so I had seen some like scenes referenced in other things, right? Like people see montages of like famous movies will show scenes. Like I've seen some stuff from this movie, so I know that HAL is a thing. I've heard HAL's voice before. I know that the guy in this pod with the lights on his face, like that's an iconic moment that I've seen before.
One of the most iconic shots ever. Yeah, incredible looking too to this day.
And so notable. Like I remember it. But I figured this guy was going to somehow lead to that, right? Like directly. Instead, there's 18 months later, boom. So that caught me off guard. All of a sudden, we're on a ship that's going to Jupiter, and again, like I'm gonna reference something that came much later, but like I was amazed at how much this ship looked just like the ship from the Event Horizon movie, which is to me an underrated classic film of cosmic horror. Like I love that movie. It's not perfect. It's got a lot of problems, but it's got such a cool idea that I absolutely love it. And don't be surprised if I one day write a book that is like at least some way influenced by that movie, because I love some of the premise stuff around that.
Well, so what you're saying is also in some way influenced by this story.
Right. And that's what I'm getting back to. Like clearly Event Horizon influenced by this movie, because the design of the ship is so similar with this long branch in between, and you got like a circle in the front and like the squarish off back, and it looks very, very similar.
Well, I mean, they consulted experts, right?
Yeah.
So they're drawing from the people who know what the fuck they're talking about.
Yeah.
And I actually had another section I wanted to read that I thought you would appreciate.
Okay.
Astronomer Carl Sagan wrote in his book The Cosmic Connection that Clarke and Kubrick had asked him how best to depict extraterrestrial intelligence. While acknowledging Kubrick's desire to use actors to portray humanoid aliens for convenience sake, Sagan argued that alien life forms were unlikely to bear any resemblance to terrestrial life, and that to do so would introduce at least an element of falseness to the film. Sagan proposed the film should simply suggest extraterrestrial superintelligence rather than depict it, and he attended the premiere and was pleased to see that he had been of some help.
Yeah, that is so well done, right? Like, there's two different kinds of stories. Yeah. When aliens resemble us, usually the more they resemble us, the more they are metaphors for some aspect of humanity, or something like that, right? Like, and the more they are unknowable and different, I think they start to become more of a concept of, to me, or a manifestation of that cosmic perspective, mm-hmm. right? Made manifest. And there is scientific thought and theory behind it, but
yeah, specifically like Carl said, to not show them is to not introduce doubt, right? Like, so to leave it more unknown, but still have the presence there, you're kind of being more scientifically accurate.
Right, because you're not introducing something where you've made a decision.
Right.
You're instead, the only decision that's made, I mean, there are some, but like few. And it feels like they're trying to get away with as few as possible. So I love that. And I have a story called They Come From the Void. And in that story, I have these like orbs of light that are alien intelligences that are very, very old, and again are sort of unknowable in a way. So I like that, and that's again me. I was trying to play with the cosmic perspective and the inherent horror to that, and so I love that stuff. It's speaking to me, man. So again, I was totally feeling that.
And getting back to like another more realistic look, instead of having like a robot walking around, our robot is a computer built into the wall, and like not having a body makes it way more frightening in a sense. Like, what were your thoughts on HAL?
I loved HAL. So out of the blue, almost, we get this whole like mini story, this plot line that plays out that's all about artificial intelligence, which I am incredibly fascinated by. I have another story that is like out right now for purchase and will later be coming out for free in Reckoning. It's all about an artificial intelligence. Like that's the entire story is written from the point of view of an artificial intelligence. So I've thought about this a lot. I think about it a lot. And I loved Hal. I thought Hal was going to be way more villainous from the way I've seen it portrayed in media and references to it, right? But I wasn't sure what was going on with Hal. Hal's very, very mysterious. I thought it was notable that Hal's shape, even in the wall, mimics that of the monolith. It's the same black rectangle, except for it has this red eye and this sort of fisheye lens perspective of the world. And the idea that is sort of an infallible machine, yet seems to be malfunctioning, and why. And I think that's kind of interpretive too, because I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll hold off on that thought until we talk more about what happens. But like, yeah, I mean, I think Hal is incredibly interesting. I love that he's being interviewed. And I could totally see this happening as we start to have these like nascent intelligences and personalities. And it's almost like a fun game. Hey, let's interview the AI. Even as we don't quite understand how actually sentient it may or may not be, because we don't still understand what sentience even is. And I love there was a line where the guy interviewing Dave says, I thought when I was interviewing Hal, I detected a sense of pride. And does it feel real emotions? And Dave's answer is essentially, it appears to, but does it actually feel emotions? Impossible to say. And I love that, because is a programmed intelligence displaying emotion because of its programming? At what point, if it's feigning that because of programming, is it indistinguishable from our quote-unquote real emotion? Like,
it's not possible to prove.
Are we as humans just feigning emotion because of chemicals in our brains and not quote-unquote really feeling them? Like, that's such a biological perspective. Is it just the fact that our machinery is made out of meat instead of out of electronics and bytes? Like, is that what makes it real?
Well, and this becomes more fascinating at the end, too, with what happens with Hal, obviously. Because, like, there's you could say that he's feigning emotion still, or you could say that there's true emotion being shown at the end. Yeah. Like, who's to say?
Well, let me back up to this sequence we were actually in. I was absolutely blown away with the shadow boxing, whatever you want to call it, jogging. He's going around the entire fucking thing, and it's all in a single unbroken shot. And I was like, I'm just imagining the rig that had to have been built to make this possible.
Look at some of the videos that I was just mentioning. You see it. It's insane.
It's so cool. And just to be like on that set and running, and then so they have the like locked camera where it looks like he's going around, and then they actually follow him so you can see what he would see in this curved thing. And there's no doubt in your mind that what you're seeing is real.
Yeah, and what's amazing too is like these actors like have to hit their marks because they'll get hurt if they don't.
Oh yeah, I was like, it has to stop, right? It gets rotating, and then when he comes to this mark, the thing has to stop rotating for him to not then start to fall. So I was amazed at like exactly. I was like, they had to time that perfectly, and there's some danger to that.
It's amazing stuff. Like, and you know that Kubrick didn't just shoot it one time because he's Kubrick. You know, he shot it like 1,000 times.
Oh, I'm sure.
I think it's clear there's maybe some ulterior motives going on. There's like a malfunction that happens. He goes out. The spacewalk is amazing, very realistic.
Well, in this lead, you have to have some details in here about the conspiracy theories surrounding Kubrick did the moon landing and like.
I honestly didn't even want to engage with it, but yes, it's definitely.
But like that had to have happened as people watched this movie come out. They know he was developing it at the same time. They're like, oh, the U.S. government would have wanted him to like use some of his effects to like fake this shit. And my thing is like, you can tell, like I can watch it and tell it's not real. Like, you know what I mean? Like I could see how people were maybe fooled back in the day, but like today you can look at the footage of this movie and see a clear difference in this and what we actually see in the film of the real moon.
Plus, even if Kubrick was faking it, there's no way he would allow for like that low quality. It would look better in a sense, right? Even if he was faking it, he wouldn't allow. His pride wouldn't allow.
Of course, it's all bullshit. But like, I just think it's funny to denote how that's like a note of how important this movie is, right?
Right.
Like,
in the context of when it came out, 100%.
and how believable it was when people looked at this and were like, holy shit. Yeah. So one other thing I want to say about HAL is I love that this quickly establishes the rules of this intelligence, right? Like, we see that it has perspective that is at least somewhat limited to what it can see and hear as he's showing it these drawings he's done. And we see its perspective. We understand that it has this certain level of emotion, but there's some ambiguity as to like how authentic it is. And we see that there's an implication of maybe it has some pride. So I love that it introduces like a little bit of personality beyond just what is like generally understood. We get the implication that maybe there's something a little more going on. And that's inherently creepy. And the idea of like man versus AI and one trying to get the better of the other, and one is sort of an like incredibly ultra intelligent version, and then man's trying to find a way to outsmart it. That's always going to be engaging storytelling, and so many movies have been made off of this.
Yeah, and of course they had the playing chess against HAL.
Yeah.
They had to have that man against machine, like losing handily. Ultimately, what ends up happening is like the AI can only process and understand what it could perceive, what it could possibly think could happen. So the only way to outsmart it or to beat it in any way is to do something imperceptible, something that's not thought possible. And like I guess you can find a loophole in the system in that way. But first, I want to talk about the sort of perceived animosity.
But did he?
Maybe not. Yeah, we'll talk about it in a second. But there's like a perceived animosity that I was feeling and I think it has something to do with like the short, to the point nature of the astronaut speaking to HAL, and then HAL also responding back, and the way that like we get, oh my god, and the POV shots of HAL were so instrumental in making it creepy, understanding like what he could see and the ways he could see it, like you said when he showed him the drawing. But they're almost like when they look at him, they almost look at him with disgust, and it's probably more of just like their serious face that they're dealing with and processing and speaking, but like they look at it with disdain sometimes, and I'm like, do they hate this thing? Being
viewed as a tool, right? And I think it's very notable that we see him just fiddling with his bed a little bit, and he's just like telling HAL to do all these things for him, and HAL's just doing it. Like he's a servant to humanity.
Yep.
And
yeah, how do you treat your Roomba at home? Because that's going to inform how you treat your AI.
Yeah, the one I don't want to say because she's listening.
Right, exactly.
In the room.
The one from Amazon.
Yeah, exactly. And like I have more theories about this, but like I think that is trying to say something about possibly the monolith itself and the way it might view humanity, and interactions between different sorts of intelligences, right? I think there's a reason we're using that and we're including that in this story that otherwise seems like, why is this AI involved? Like, it almost seems like a distraction.
It's notable that it's segmented, right? The film is segmented into 4 different parts, and they do feel almost separate, but then they obviously have the connecting tissue that makes them all relevant together.
There's one line, which we'll get to later, that I'm going to tell you, like, completely recontextualizes everything that happens with HAL for me.
Yeah. Well, and you got to think about the fact that like HAL seemingly is in no way connected to the monolith. So there's almost 2 antagonists or sort of other forces that humanity is contending with, right? So it's like this AI thing, and then also this other intelligence that's like beyond them. And it's like, is there a commentary being made about like humanity potentially not being able to perceive this other entity, but them creating something that might be able to perceive that entity in some way or something like that?
Humanity itself, our reach may be limited in our physical forms, but the things we create might not have the limitations that we currently have. We can create a machine that can self-repair and potentially go on and on and on. And you could see a situation where we could craft an AI to quote-unquote man a ship, where that AI is not limited by the fact that it's going to take 1,000 years to get somewhere. That's not a big deal for an AI. And we've created it, so it is an extension of self in that sense. And it's a creation of humanity, yet the thing that arrives wherever it's going is not a human. It is something we've created, right?
It's a tool.
It's a tool we've flung into space. Yeah.
Or a weapon. So I'm going to read this next part. While Frank is on a spacewalk attempting to replace the antenna unit, Hal takes control of his pod, setting him adrift. Dave takes another pod to rescue Frank. While he is outside, Hal turns off the life support functions of all 3 other crew members in suspended animation, killing them. When Dave returns to the ship with Frank's body, Hal refuses to let him in, stating that the astronauts' plan to deactivate him jeopardizes the mission. Dave opens the ship's emergency airlock manually, enters the ship, and proceeds to Hal's processor core, where he begins disconnecting Hal's circuitry, despite being begged not to. When disconnection is complete, a pre-recorded video by Haywood plays, revealing that the mission's objective is to investigate the radio signal sent from the monolith to Jupiter.
So much to talk about, but I do want to first off acknowledge some incredible sequences. The floating in space, again, without CGI, you have this guy like twisting and turning in ways that seem extremely difficult. You see stars behind, these spacewalks. The way the ships approach each other, like I'm like, okay, this is a model, but this is clearly a person. Again, I don't know how this stuff was done, but I'm sure trickery is afoot. Looks incredible. I like that there was a color language going on to tell us like who's who. Like Dave has the red suit, the other guy has that yellow suit. We see the tablets at one point we were talking about before. Like there's so many things that were predicted with such incredible accuracy. Camera phones, or not camera phones, but like basically FaceTime communications. It did seem that like they were aware of the time delay that would be in effect here, so we didn't see live conversations with people back on Earth, which I thought was good. It seemed that the interview was like pre-recorded, that they were watching later. So there's just a lot of great little details, scientifically accurate. I guess I didn't know how accurate this movie was going to be. I didn't know how well it would stand up over time, but I was amazed with the level of accuracy.
So Hal like hits this guy with the ship, right? And he's like floating in space.
Unclear. I didn't know what happened to him. He goes flying off, and I was like,
it's not shown directly, but the pod starts moving on its own. Like it's just sitting there, and then it starts moving.
But then this pod also goes like spinning off, right? Like maybe it got hit. I thought the implication was maybe it got hit by an asteroid, because we saw the asteroids flying through through space at one point. I don't know. I got the implication Hal did it because it zooms in on Hal and it makes a noise, and I was like, okay, Hal did this, but how and why, I wasn't clear.
Right. Yeah, I assumed that it had something to do with the that he flew the ship like sort of into him and knocked him off or something like that. Or
yeah, maybe turned it in a way. Yeah.
I was in one of these interviews that I referenced. There was one where somebody was talking about the outside of the ships, and that they had like textured them with sort of like gears and things that you see on the outside. That becomes the language of ships in outer space going forward. And you like look at it and you're like, oh yeah, like it seems like there's something going on there that I don't know how that works, but that's functioning. Like there's something there that's helping this ship fly through space. Like all these little textures and like radars and gadgets and gizmos on there.
Amazing.
Dave has to go out and retrieve Frank, and it's this really tense scene where he goes out. He goes straight out there. He goes, retrieves him, brings him back, and that's when Hal says,
calm when he goes to the pod.
Yep.
Like he's like, all right, my only other companion other than Hal just is hurtling through space. Gonna just calmly walk down to the pod, tell Hal to open the door in my normal voice. No, like sense of urgency.
I do think it is a good juxtaposition for the way that he reacts eventually to some of the other things that happen too. Right?
Yeah, no. I mean, he's so calm in this moment to where when we see what he goes through, how just like unbelievably emotive it is by comparison.
Right. Well, this is something he's trained for and something he's ready for in a sense, right? Like something dramatic that would get your heart rate up, of course, but it's something that he's like ready to experience if he needs to. What he goes through later is not.
Yeah.
So he brings him back, and then the famous line, "Open the pod bay doors, Hal."
Yeah. Hal's like, I'm afraid I can't do that.
Yeah. It's haunting. It's like every nightmare that anyone who worries about AI is afraid to hear one day. There's so many ways that we give away our freedoms, or will be giving away our freedoms to automation, that this kind of stuff is gonna become a reality, maybe potentially.
Yeah. I mean, but that's only on one level. So yeah, on the surface level, Hal has identified the importance of this mission, committed a mistake, and now that he's being threatened with being deactivated, in order to preserve the integrity of this and the importance of this mission, has decided to eliminate the other two guys. But what doesn't make sense is why does he eliminate the scientists?
I would pose that all of it was planned and he never made a mistake.
That's what I was going to say. That's why that doesn't ultimately hold up to me. And ultimately what holds up to me is how actually is fairly infallible. And everything that occurs is orchestrated by Hal in a way.
Yeah.
And
he orchestrated them going out on these spacewalks so that he could eventually kill one of them, and they would go to retrieve the other, and then he would have control of the ship potentially. But it's crazy to think like the sort of programming.
But why? It was so Hal controls it, but is someone behind it, or is Hal making the determination to do this itself, or is Hal being influenced by alien intelligence?
Well, you could say maybe that last one, but I think it's more the second one. I think that Hal makes a very specific point that humanity is what's fallible in all of these situations. Everything that happens is always humanity's fault.
So is Hal trying to usurp humanity?
Preserve the mission and make sure that like it's carried out due to the way that he was programmed and what he wanted, and he wants to get rid of the human error.
Okay, I can see that. Like he wants, and I like that line about human error. It's always human error. That does give a lot of credence to what you're saying. You could also see it, though, that the monolith, one of the only things we've seen it do is communicate information via a signal. So you could interpret that as an ability to communicate with Hal. And if you open the door to that maybe Hal has actually been in communication in some way with a monolith, then anything's open. Like this could...
I do think that is a read.
Yeah, this could be a manipulation of the monolith to get this guy and this guy alone to be the one who eventually makes this sort of journey we see occur. I don't know. I think multiple readings are on the table. I'm okay with that ambiguity. I think it's interesting. I think it's fascinating to discuss. It's interesting to watch the movie from different way and interpreting it different ways. I do think the surface level Hal made a mistake doesn't end up holding up because there are too many questions unanswered. If Hal made a mistake and is only wanting to preserve the mission, why does Hal kill the scientists? And I think that has to be what you're saying. That, yes, maybe Hal made a mistake, or maybe didn't, but regardless, Hal is trying to take control to eliminate the possibility of error because Hal recognizes how important the mission is. Also, I don't know about you, but I got an intermission.
Yeah. Of course, yeah.
like it was like a minute long, too. Just an intermission. We got some music.
There's a famous story about the intermission sort of not being where it was originally, and I guess Kubrick wasn't fully aware of when the intermission was being placed and the sort of overture as you're coming into the theater. There's a lot of things like around like the way that this has been presented, and I guess like fairly recently in Japan they did a screening that tried to replicate exactly how the projection and the music would bring you in, and you would sit down, and then the music that would play in the intermission, and then the outro and everything like perfectly as Kubrick intended when he first showed the movie. Interesting to think about, but yeah, I
what
appreciate
happened to the people who saw that. Did they all get transported to another place in the universe, I assume?
Yeah, probably. I appreciate a good intermission. I'm not gonna lie. There's something very...
Bring them back, man. I've talked about this before.
It's awesome. It's the best, and it promotes conversation.
Yeah, give you a chance to walk out, get a snack, go to the bathroom, maybe have a brief moment where you can talk with your friends who came to the movie with you about, hey, how are you enjoying it? You know, what do you think's happening?
Right. It's the putting down of the book too, right? Like when you read a book, you get a chance to put it down, process, walk away.
That's why people like TV shows. They can take breaks between episodes.
It's fun, especially for a longer film. I appreciate it. I like it. And I've been to a few road shows where they do like I went to the Hateful Eight.
Me too. I also did Hateful Eight. Yep.
And they had the intermission. It was so much fun. Everyone talked in the crowd when you're out there. Like that I love that environment. Sort of a film festival vibe.
Yeah, very cool. Another horror element we got to talk about. The idea of being put in a stasis. And they were put in stasis before they were even on the ship. And then just being executed while you're in this like state of almost like sleep. Like that is horrifying in and of itself. So again, there are elements of horror throughout this movie. This intelligence of Hal uncaring. And it says like, you know, at one point, this conversation serves no more purpose. And then it just stops.
Yep. Well, and I love that being flipped back on its head, right? So this whole Hal conversation leads us to
he's begging to be let back in,
right?
And then
and then Dave won't respond to him, and he's like, Dave, please, and so like, you know, that flip is so awesome.
But I did love that the lines that get repeated over and over again of like, I can feel my mind breaking or my mind shutting down.
Did he really?
Or is he just appealing to emotion? Is it a cold AI manipulating and trying to manipulate, or is it an emotional AI genuinely showing emotion, or is it a super cold AI deliberately trying to pretend that it's showing emotion, knowing that it won't be believed, and playing like 5D chess? I mean, right, they showed a game of chess, right? Like, or whatever. It's not just chess itself is very complex. Is it just playing chess in a way of like multiple moves ahead, right? Like is Hal manipulating everything?
So we got to talk about when he's on his way back, he actually breaks back into the ship in a sequence that's really tense as well, where he turns all the alarms off and he turns off all the safety measures and he launches himself in.
We kept seeing those explosive bolt signs and I was like, this has got to mean something. Sure enough. It looked painful. I was like, I don't know, like, was that a stuntman who got fucking launched into something? Like,
probably.
Yeah,
I don't know.
It looked pretty brutal. I think he slammed his head into something at one point.
So at the end of Hal's life, apparently, we don't know for sure, but what seems like the end of Hal's life, he sort of reverts to his original program and he starts singing a song.
Oh man, that song, so good. And then it's slowly getting lower and breaking. It's like, that's so fucking good. It reminds me of Archive 81, which we just covered recently, where you have the tape sort of distorting and how creepy that can be. And it's like the death song of this AI is really powerful.
So that song is called Daisy Bell, and it's a vaudeville song that had already been used as one of the earliest pieces of electronic music, as it was the first song ever programmed into a computer to be played back using a simulation of speech synthesis.
Wow.
So it's a reference to the history of technology in that way.
That's cool.
And then also, if you're on TikTok, that song is used frequently as like a popular song.
Really?
And it's like sort of distorted and sung in the same kind of way as a reference to this, just the idea of technology singing and distorting is creepy. And then the song has the line that's like, I'm half crazy.
Yeah.
And like, all of those things are just like, wow, it honestly gives me goosebumps thinking about it. Like how creepy all of the Hal stuff is.
Yeah. Gosh, so good. And then the moment where he actually goes into Hal, like the big mainframe and the lights, and it's all red.
Looked great it looked really good when he's pulling all those slides out.
Yeah, like like
that top-down view.
He's like pulling apart the brain one thing at a time. Like, that's so cool.
And you talked about the distorting speech. It's amazing. But we got to move on to this next section here. This is I'm not going to read this because there's some interpretation that's being done by the summary here. I'm going to kind of go off of memory of what we're seeing.
Yeah.
And you react to what happened in this film here at the end.
What I think happened.
We get, for sure, Dave gets to Jupiter, leaves in one of the EVAs, starts flying away, and then there's some sort of monolith, like sort of triangle that's flying around and then lines up with these planets. And then the next thing we look up and we start going through this sort of whooshing of colors and seemingly portal of some kind. We have about a 10-minute scene of different colors, and we're going to talk about how that was achieved practically and how amazing and groundbreaking that is on its own. We get Dave waking up in this white room with sort of some Greek architecture kind of, and a bed and a
paintings.
Room, and he's turning. He's turning, and we see him age. We see an older version of himself. Then we turn again. We see a seemingly an older version of himself eating. Turn again. We see an older version laying in a bed, looking sickly. And then we turn, I believe, and then turn back and see some sort of child.
Well, there's the monolith looking down at him.
The monolith, yeah, of course, yeah. And then the child, and then we get a
embryo almost.
Embryo,
fetus.
Yeah. And then we get a transition with that embryo next to a planet, seemingly Earth.
Yeah.
And then that's the end of the film.
Yeah. Okay. So first off, yeah, the trippiness of this travel through space. I guess I kind of knew something like this must happen in this movie. I'd seen an image of the baby before, so I knew that I didn't know what it was, but like I'd seen that before. So I was like ever so slightly spoiled for this. But still, I had no context for it when I saw it, right? And my heart was pounding so hard during the sequence. And I'm like, I don't know why. And I think it was because we kept getting these flashes of Dave apparently in some sort of agony as he's like transporting through this. What's actually happening? Where's he going, right? Like it seems like some sort of portal, wormhole, maybe, something like that. And I kept thinking about a lot of the theories surrounding like what is like to approach a black hole. That's what Interstellar is all about. But there's like there's an interesting theory about like, and I can't explain it. I'm not a theoretical physicist, clearly. But there is a theory about how maybe there's one version of you that is sort of suspended, and there's one version of you that goes through that spaghettification they talk about. You're sort of torn apart as you enter the black hole, and how there are two simultaneous versions of you that exist. I don't know how that all works, but I was thinking about that, right? I was thinking about being torn apart, but also that separation of self. And when I started seeing the way he sees himself in these scenes, and the self that he sees perceives the previous version of self, right? Like they're interconnected, they're existing in an overlapping time. And to me, that shows that distortion of time that, you know, space is so famous for, that time dilation, and how he's aging so rapidly, and then yet becomes a baby. There's also a moment during the transition where the ship itself, this little pod, takes on a very sperm-like appearance. Things get very liquid. And I thought there was an implication that perhaps some sort of conjoining, whether metaphorically or literal, in almost a pregnancy sense, like he's impregnating the universe, is very, very masculine. I don't know. And you know, the thing that holds up with that is that we do eventually get an embryo, right? Who appears human, but maybe also beyond human. Like something about the eyes and the way that like the face actually resembles the actor a little bit of this baby, which I thought was super creepy because he's very angular for a freaking fetus. So trippy. That sequence with the monolith is so cool because like when the EVA is in the room looks like a one particular size, but then the EVA is gone and it looks like the room is a different size. There's so many trippy things going on in this room. It's clearly like a construct or something that has been created to communicate something to Dave by this other intelligence. But I think by design, that communication is unknowable and abstract. And when the monolith is at the foot of the bed, to me, it was the implication that you are dying. This version of you has just rapidly aged to death, and you are going to be reborn through this conjoining, this merging of something that has occurred that perhaps has always been planned. Perhaps this is what this monolith always wanted. I don't know. And this baby is created that then views Earth, and like has it gone back to Earth, or is it just the knowledge? Is it just like an imparting of like all knowledge has been given to this new life form, where it can see Earth from this new perspective?
We also need to talk about that Stargate sequence, which is what people have named it. And there's a lot of these things that have been named, like Moon Gazer, I believe, is the name of the monkey, the hominin at the beginning. Star Child is the name of the child, and Stargate is this here. So there's names for all this stuff now. So yeah, this Stargate here, the way that they achieved this is pretty amazing. They mounted colored transparencies to the back of a mechanical rig. The illuminated patterns were visible through a narrow slit on the opposite side. Now, this gets back into that thing that I was talking about before called slit scan effect, which there's a video that I talked about earlier that you should all check out to get more background on this. But the idea is the patterns were only visible through a narrow slit on the opposite side of the rig. While the camera moved towards the slit, the transparencies were passed in front of the light. Each dolly in exposed half a single frame. To complete the sequence, technicians had to repeat the process over and over again. Stanley Kubrick originally only set out to complete a handful of preliminary tests, but eventually they rented space in an abandoned brazier factory and turned it into a chemical lab, and were doing all these wild tests with the footage. And there's like droplets blobbed into white paint, lacquer sort of vats and things like that were filmed, and Kubrick shot some of these drip effects himself in a small dark room in New York City.
Wow.
So like all kinds of wild stuff went into the special effects and creation of the scene, and it's been referenced a million times. Oh, yeah. It was probably the thing that people walked out of the film originally having just like freaked out, having seen something different. I read one story that there was like an audience member in the 60s that like freaked out and like started screaming that they had seen God and like dove through the screen. So
they were probably on something if that actually occurred.
Probably. And that actually, brings it back. It wasn't a smash hit right away, but I guess like theaters convinced MGM to leave it in theaters longer so that because there was like a contingent of like psychedelic takers that would go watch this movie.
We gotta take something and go watch this movie. That's a whole different experience, I'm sure.
So there was like a big surge in money, I guess, in ticket sales for just that.
Yeah, I can see that.
I think that you are all along the same lines that I usually have as well, and I still do. And it's that this is. First of all, I think that this scene is clearly motivated by whatever forces are controlling this monolith or whatever is going on with that. So he's clearly brought through some sort of experience in the unknown. And then it gets to a point where you think that this person, like trying to think about what Kubrick was getting into and what I thought for the first time, I think that I saw it as these creatures sort of capturing and like putting this kind of in the way that you said, in Interstellar, for example, it's like this tesseract that they pull him through, and then he's able to see things into certain areas and times of his life. This is him being pulled into something that he can perceive as a human being that these people have created for him, right? This like cage almost. And I don't know that like it's supposed to be literal that he's turning and seeing himself old at the same time, or if it really is and he's perceiving time differently. But either way, it feels like he's being observed, like he's sort of being observed. And it kind of reminds me now, having read the story somewhat recently, of The Egg, and this idea of like someone interacting with an entity beyond their understanding. And does he pass some sort of test? Is this a test? Is this just something that was always going to happen to him?
Was the whole thing a test?
Does he pass it? Does he now become some sort of godly embryo?
If it was controlling Hal in some way.
True. Reaching out to him through the communication like you were talking about.
I don't know, and is he perceiving it? Or is he being observed? Yes, I feel like he's being observed, but I also felt like he was observing himself.
Yeah.
And throughout all these scenes, I felt his perspective sort of consistently viewing it in horror.
But it's strange that he wasn't, it was still chronological. He was still getting older. It's not like he was seeing himself younger and then older. You know what I mean? So it's almost like,
well, it goes through a transition
forward in time still
until it starts over. Yeah.
So what is that? Yeah, it's really tough to say exactly what was being thought of here. And I did find something from Arthur C. Clarke that I want to read, and it's that if you understand 2001 completely, we failed. We wanted to raise far more questions than we answered.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah.
He later expressed some concerns that the film is too hard to follow and explained things more fully in the novelization and subsequent sequels.
Which perfectly sets me up for talking about what we're going to do next week, which is we're going to read that novelization and going to get some more answers, at least from Arthur C. Clarke's perspective. I'm going to have a week to reflect on this movie and this discussion we just had, and and read that book. So I'm really excited that we get to come back to this thing at least one more time and talk about it some more, because there's so much. It feels like there's got to be some other angles I haven't considered yet. And if you have not read the novelization, maybe even have no interest in reading it, you should still check out our episode, because we'll tell you like what it was like and what we got out of it. We'll break it all down. So hopefully you will join us next week for that.
Yeah, and also I didn't talk a ton about Kubrick himself, sort of as a filmmaker, because I knew that we wouldn't have time here, but we have covered Kubrick many times before, so go check out our Dr. Strangelove or our Shining coverage.
Yep. Which are both good episodes, in my opinion. Kubrick always has so much we can talk about, so if you're a Kubrick fan, do check those out. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please let us know in the form of a rating and review. Super helpful for getting the word out on this podcast. If you're one of those people that I met at the Nebulas and you liked this thing, I'd love to hear from you in the form of that rating and review, whatever app you chose to listen on.
Yeah, and make sure to connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at Ink to Film. And I think we're basically on any other social media platform you can look.
Yeah, I made a TikTok recently, Ink to Film, and I put up a little clip of a Stand By Me quote with actually movie scenes behind it. So if you want to check that out, follow us on TikTok or at Ink to Film on there.
We also have a Patreon. Make sure to check that out. It's a great way to support us other than leaving a rating or review.
Yeah.
We have many different categories. And for just $2 a month, you get our bonus episodes. And monthly, we cover adaptation adjacent things. And recently we did Clueless, which was a sort of different interpretation of Emma by Jane Austen. So yeah, check that out.
Yeah, we'd love to have you over there. All kinds of stuff. I think almost 50 episodes. And we have merch and all sorts of things you get access to. So just check out our Patreon. We'd love to have your support. Okay, man. So next week, we're coming back for 2001, A Space Odyssey, and talking about our very first novelization. We've never done a watch first, followed by a read. What do you think? How did it go? How do you like it?
I think that it's going to be bizarre to go to the story now, having seen all of this, but I do think it'll give some good background. And I also, I think that covering a movie first is it's a very interesting feeling. I think a lot of times if we're covering the story that inspired a film that I've already seen, I get to sort of orient myself within the film and sort of remember certain things that I definitely want to talk about. And this time it was like a massive project, and it was like, all right, go. And I was like, all right, I had to try to find everything to talk about. So hopefully we did a good job. Let us know. There'll probably be some other things I'll touch on with the film next week that I forgot. But again, there's a ton to read out there too. Go check out all the materials that I was talking about and do some reading out there.
And one of the reasons we wanted to do novelization second is I think it's a very famous one. So if there are any other really famous novelizations out there that you would like for us to cover in a similar way to this one, and you think maybe we should, let us know if you happen to still be listening. Thank you for sticking around to the very end. And until next time,
keep adapting.